joining. Just as a very quick overview of what the event will be, we will begin with presentations of all the academic completed works published in this university meeting, presented by our local office editors who are joining us both in person and on Zoom. And then we will be moving on to a faculty panel, which Karen and I are the peer review on the report. So with that, we want to express thank everyone for being here, and also especially to all the members of the editorial board. We are just so incredibly grateful to be working this semester and last semester. It is an honor to present our seventh issue of the Columbia Journal of Asia. Volume 1, Issue 2 features 14 creative and scholarly pieces by undergraduates and recent graduates from across the United States, Europe, and elsewhere, presented in 3 sessions. Creative works, which this year include art, poetry, and prose, notes, which are brief academic essays, and articles, which are long-form research papers. These works, which span history, political science, literature, and the arts, illuminate narratives of revolution and resistance across borders, from student activism in colonial Burma to the defiance of Chinese settler colonialism in Tibet to comparative ideas of socialist revolution across Asia. We believe that this is a crucial intervention academically and artistically. It is one that allows us to move beyond colonial era portrayals of Asians that deny Asian subjects political agency, and to envision solidarities across Asian communities and communities beyond Asia, across linguistic, regional, and African works. As many of you know, CJA officially launched this spring, and it remains the first and only undergraduate publication at Columbia to focus on Asian and regional diaspora. When we first imagined 101 years ago, we saw the need for a space that would center Asian histories and narratives without separating this silo. Where you have cast for narratives as purely supplemental to the Western academic and literary canon, which is troublingly limited in its existing form, we work to shape CJA as an inclusive platform in the community. Our journal and the stories held between its covers are defined not by the absence of Asian narratives in Western academic and artistic circles, but by the integral role they play in broader global and transnational contexts, particularly in narratives of resistance and revolution featured in this issue. Excitingly, CJA was able to launch the guest speaker series in large part thanks to our other director, Manan Ahmed. This semester, to carry this mission beyond the beach. She's been a new novelist, literary classical musician, and vocabulary for reading and seamless novel Saver, which was the for. And Columbia University history professor Peterson and Isabel Alonso for moderating conversation about historical memory and the colonial era. Taking as its point of departure, they're going to try the conversation with. So our many initiatives this semester, we believe reflect combined efforts of amazing students, undergraduates, graduate students, faculty, and Columbia community members. We firstly want to thank our managing editor, Dr. who joined us on Zoom at this time, and we also really want to thank Dr. Karna, who's great to us in person. Both of them have been with us since the journal was a very, very small idea. It was a 6-person team, and very much up in the air. And this journal would not be possible without their continued amazing work. We're so grateful. We also want to thank our incredible editorial board of Columbia University Environmental College, including our article editors, creative editors, production editors, and outreach team, as well as our lead editors in the article and creator editor sections who have done incredible work in including our production this semester. And we want to thank our graduate peer reviewers from across Columbia, Harvard, Yale, New York University, and other institutions whom Karna has been in direct correspondence with. One of the benefits, but also the disadvantages of us being a double-blind peer review system is that we never get to actually name our peer reviewers, and so we can't have that name, but we want to just take a moment to recognize the work that they put in to give amazing edits to everyone's articles and notes. And finally, we would like to extend our deepest gratitude to the members of our faculty advisory board, Professors Manan Ahmed, Isabel Alonso, Tadiar, Manan Ahmed, and across the departments of History, Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies, East Asian minorities and cultures, and Indian gender and scholarly studies. Their scholarship and insights have been invaluable to us and inspiring. And they've also just been incredibly kind to lend us their time and joining us for our various initiatives and for our speaker series this semester. So the both of us, alongside Dr. and Karna, are incredibly proud to be with this issue, passing on the work of phenomenal leadership
the publication today are from the completion of volume 1. So we really look forward to supporting this journal and our other mission as it continues to grow in ways and we'll be around towards your years. So yeah, we'll be seeing us, but we're also excited. We will be introducing our new leadership of the team at the end of the year, but we're very excited for that to take forward and adding to our next chapter of CPA. So we will get started. We are beginning with a brief presentation of our cover for this issue, which is the lots of incredible people. We're very grateful for. Yeah, so our cover was designed this semester by Isabel Alonso, who is a junior and colonial colonist in economics. For us, sadly, the person today that did share with us some words about how we need to do the cover. And so, one of you something on this. So this is really for us. I read through the abstracts and the creative pieces in Western action, like the days of revolution, progress, and change. I came up with a design of drawing purely from the aesthetic aspects of different theater conditions made them. For example, I love to have native styles from technology and community, having design from Manan Ahmed and costume of Virginia Julie. This decision was made as a way to create something that people can identify as Asian elements, not specific to any one country. The decision to make the fire is to communicate this idea of change in our reason and perspective. Right, and with this, you will be moving into presentations on the academic consistency. After that, we will be having our presentation of creative difference. So you can move the slides.
There might be a small issue. Can you guys hear us on Zoom?
No.
I know Durga was having some issues.
Audio.
Not very
They can't
clearly.
hear us.
It's not
Okay,
quite.
that's
It's not
not
very
good.
clear.
We're
Some
that is not ideal. What if I move this? Someone, if you say something.
Can you hear us now?
I think the issue is like there's audio, but it's just not very clear.
Yeah, this is unmuted. Why don't I just bring this up with
It's
us?
just that they can't hear us to reply or like we actually.
We're not muted. This is definitely not muted. Okay, what if I just there?
Excuse the view. but-
Yes, you're just gonna be seeing us, unfortunately.
Is this better?
How is this?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. We're gonna keep the mic here. We're gonna be fine. So glad. All right. So yes, with this, let's move on to academic presentations. Wonderful. Yes. So Jacqueline is zooming in from work, so sadly cannot be presenting these live, but we wanted to just take a moment to acknowledge the tremendous hard work that Jacqueline puts into making sure that the edits for all of these pieces are done. She is incredible. She has been doing this job for the full year and had so many wonderful things to say about the articles and the notes in this issue. We have short presentations from the authors, so we can begin with our first presentation. If Karna, you want to. All right, so yes, so our first piece is Against a Rupture Narrative, Japanese Western Learning from Tokugawa to Meiji.
Hi everyone, my name is Aidan Lilienfeld. I majored in history at the University of Chicago, which is where I wrote the original draft of this paper. I am now a reporter at the Japanese newspaper, the Asahi Shimbun. I took a lot of classes in undergrad on empire and colonialism in modern East Asia, both from within, like from the Qing Empire or the Japanese Empire, and from without, like from Europe and America. Although in all these cases they involve victims and perpetrators, I find it really valuable to look at the ways in which countries on the receiving end of the imperial sword fought back, not just with weaponry, but with ideology and rhetoric. I wrote my undergraduate dissertation on the rhetorical side of Japanese anti-foreignism in the mid-19th century, and I use this current paper as a chance to explore a bit more on the scientific, philosophical, and nationalist movements in 19th century Japan that continually adapted to foreign influence. Japan practiced the know thy enemy approach during this period by moving and sometimes racing to adopt technology and administration practices from Germany, England, America, France, etc. in order to counter those very empires. The story of Japan in this period is far from black and white, as are all the stories of resistance to imperial expansion. And I think these very same principles can be seen today in global power relationships and technology races. Thank you very much.
All right, yes, we have inaudible lessons.
Hello, my name is Carolyn Yao, and I wrote Inaudible Lessons, Interpreting the Amplitude of Silence in the Lotus Sutra for a seminar taught by Professor Ryuichi Abe at Harvard University. Through grounding my essay in a close reading of Burton Watson's English translation of the Lotus Sutra, I reflect on the Buddha's motivations for maintaining silence and his teachings through wordlessness. Drawing attention to the encompassing internal and external influences of silence, I describe how they all lead to personal liberation and encourage compassion. I chose to explore the meaning of silence in this Buddhist text because, as an art history major, I am interested in the experiential dimension of viewing Buddhist artworks. The experience of writing this essay has helped me realize that soundless media, including paper and silk, carry the capacity to communicate both visual and oral messages. Thank you.
We have Reclaiming the Land of Snows, Analyzing Chinese Settler Colonialism in Tibet. It was edited by Fatma and Karan, who are both here with us. So if you would like to just briefly introduce yourselves as the editors, we'll move on to the presentation, if you just want to say a few words.
Hi,
Yes.
I'm Fatma. I am a sophomore at college majoring in Middle Eastern and South East.
Hi, I'm Carl. I'm a junior in Columbia College studying economics and political science.
We go into the presentation from our author, who is also at Columbia. So,
my name is Shora Ramanujan, and I'm a sophomore in Columbia College. I've always been fascinated by various cultures and religions in Asia, and Tibet is so interesting to me because the region is situated in the Himalayas and at the confluence of various countries such as China, India, Nepal, Bhutan, and more. So Tibet's historical and cultural development as this type of borderland is something that I wanted to explore more deeply. I also have a long-standing interest in discourses about empire and settler colonialism in particular. So I thought it would be interesting to place these two ideas in conversation with one another, particularly in a non-Eurocentric context that, comparatively, does not have a ton of existing literature coverage. So in this piece, I explore the different strategies employed by China in the Tibetan region, and I also explore the development of self-immolation as a unique form of protest that has both religious and political significance. By drawing on various thinkers, from Patrick Wolf to Frantz Fanon, as well as academic scholars and primary sources from the Tibetan region, I hope to provide more nuance regarding the entanglement of Tibetans and their land, as well as how this relationship is used to inform the spirit of resistance and endure the colonial project of historical erasure. Thank you.
Manan Ahmed's Bisymmetrical Self was edited by Andrew Linda.
I'm Linda. I'm a freshman at CC. Thinking about studying comparative literature, French and Chinese.
And I think we can do this.
live.
We'll keep our eyes on it. All right, but I don't think for this one we have an author presentation, but it's a fascinating piece. I don't know if you want to say anything a little more about it.
Yeah, so basically Tawara Machi is a contemporary Japanese female woman poet, and she is famous for Salad Anniversary, which is a collection of tanka poems that evokes this trope of the waiting woman in traditional tanka form. And the argument of Claire from Cornell, the writer of this essay, is that she disagrees with mainstream scholarly discourse that Tawara Machi reinforces this traditional trope. Like instead, she sees Tawara kind of exploring the multiple dimensions of this waiting woman, kind of not just following the I'm waiting outside, but instead reclaiming sort of this kind of reclaiming it for herself, for like the people.
Wonderful piece. Yeah, very excited to read it.
Hi, my name is Claire Patzner, and I'm a 2022 graduate of Cornell University who majored in English, and I wrote a note titled Tawara Machi's Bisymmetrical Self. I like to read the abstract from it. Tawara Machi is one of the most famous contemporary Japanese poets after the success of her collection of poetry titled Salad Anniversary. This collection of poetry utilized vivid imagery of everyday activities and revitalized the traditional Japanese tanka poetic form. While literary critics often view her poetry as anti-feminist writing that relies heavily on the waiting woman trope popularized by early Tanka poetry, I argue that her work is multidimensional and expands on this trope. Although her writing involves more passive feminism than famous Japanese feminist poets such as Hiromi Ito, it should not be dismissed as docile or unprogressive. Critics also claim that her poetry is flat and one-note, likely due to its accessible language and short format. However, I believe that her poems are more layered than one might think and that critics should re-examine her work, despite its overwhelming popularity. In this short essay, I will analyze a selection of Tawara's poems from her famous collection titled Salad Anniversary and prove their duality and nuance. Thank you.
Now to our next piece. This one we will be presenting because our author and editor couldn't be here.
I'm going to unmute. We'll mute that. Thanks. All right. Okay, excellent. All right. So yes. So this piece is entitled The Presence of the Sovereign, an Investigation Across Socialist Spaces. Yeah. Yes. Oh, actually we do no test. Yeah. Oh, you have the, oh, fantastic. Okay, great. Fatima will present for us.
So I read exactly what the theory is. Want to let go. I was delivering three editors learned in this set. Jacqueline writes, North saying the presence of a sovereign investigation across social spaces was a pleasure to work on this past semester. A fascinating look into the culture surrounding governments in Vietnam, China, and North Korea. The piece is highly interdisciplinary, combining sociology, philosophy, and ecology and history. Both Desi and I greatly enjoyed learning about this topic and editing working with Nora, who is not only timely and receptive, but incredibly enthusiastic. We highly recommend checking out this piece.
Hi everyone, my name is Nora Zhang, and I'm currently a rising junior in CC, majoring in anthropology and history. For history, my specialization is 20th century history, especially that of the socialist states. So this paper is in fact a tentative attempt in pulling up a comparative study into reverberations or figures, or even biological flesh of the first socialist leaders. As discussed in the notes, such reverberations in fact often take various forms, both in folk religious practices and also more ideological or even theological constructions. I wish to offer a more comprehensive view in socialist as well as post-socialist sovereignties. So my thoughts in this paper, in fact, are largely to Alexei Yurchak's work on the dead bodies of Lenin. After Lenin passed away, his dead body is in fact preserved and also constantly maintained by the central government of the Soviet Union and now Russia. There has been a very interesting debate on the place in which the sovereignty of the Soviet Union resides, and Yurchak's final conclusion is that such sovereignty is inevitably tied with the dead bodies of Lenin. As for limitations, I'm pretty sure that one thing is that I haven't elaborated that much on the idea of remembrance and also mourning. I guess I could also draw more on the theoretical work of Foucault's biopolitics, Derrida's ontology, and especially Walter Benjamin's work, view on history. Again, if you have any suggestions or ideas that could improve my argument, please just contact me. Thank you.
So yes, our final piece is entitled Tiger Symbolism in the British Raj, Colonialism and Animal History at India's Continent. A very fascinating approach that the author has chosen to take. It was edited by Ashfa and Durga, so you both are welcome to introduce yourselves. I know Durga's on Zoom, maybe Ashfa, you go first, we'll have Durga on Zoom, and then we can go to the presentation.
First, hi everyone, my name is Ashfa. I'm a sophomore at Columbia studying political science and rights. And yeah, I believe Durga's on Zoom, but I just wanted to say this is really fantastic piece to work on, and I believe Durga wanted to share a little bit more on the process.
So yeah, Durga, please need to take it away.
Right. Yeah, so I'm a sophomore in the dual degree program.
Or do we have to wait, sorry.
Can you hear me?
Okay, there, I think.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So I'm Durga, and I'm a sophomore in the dual degree program between Columbia and Sciences Po, and I'm majoring in politics, government, and law at Sciences Po, and I'm currently in France. And like Ashfa mentioned, I too really enjoyed reading this article. it was a really unique perspective on animal history and colonialism. And yeah, I believe Anna had a video explaining the article as well.
Hi, my name is Anna Teodorescu, and I am an economics and history major at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. I wrote my research paper, Tiger Symbolism in the British Raj, Colonialism and Animal History of the Indian Subcontinent, for a summer history course I took with Professor Joanna Dean on animal history. I wanted to explore British colonialism in India from a perspective that is perhaps a little less traditional than usual. So, using the tiger as its centerpiece, my paper discusses themes of racism, power dynamics, and gender roles during the period, and how the symbolic imagery of the tiger was used in constructing powerful cultural identities, as well as prejudices that still resonate with many people around the world today. British presence in India, which started with the East India Company in 1600 and was only officially ended with the partitioning of the British Raj in 1947, had a detrimental impact on Indian cultural identity. My essay aims to add to this discussion by looking at various artifacts and art pieces from the period that immortalized British sentiment towards India, many of which are in protected and beloved collections of museums in the West today. My intention in writing this paper was to emphasize symbolism and its direct repercussions as the tiger shifted from a symbol of power and prestige to a representation littered with racialized overtones, and ultimately what this meant for human as well as animal history. Thank you.
That concludes our notes section, and now we will be talking about arts.
So that's another shout out to the full legend edited mapping and the story of Oman, as we said. Yes, articles are long academic pieces, and so we have support for this.
Do you want to unmute? There we go. Yeah. So without further ado, we'll move on to the presentations for the articles. So first, we have cartography of sound, body mapping, and border crossings in K. Ulande Barrett's Northern Organs, Aldrin Valdez's ESL, or you weren't here. It seems as though we did not list our editors for this particular slide. Yeah, okay. Do we have the editors for this piece?
I think Linda, it was you and Taskia? Oh, Jenny. Okay, yes.
Would you like to say a few words
about
the piece?
So this was a really fascinating piece. It talks about kind of the queer Philippines Americans, and their poetry. Barrett and Valdez are two queer Filipinx American poets, and in Joe's article, she talked about how we can use their poetry to transcend categorization and look at alternative ways of mourning. And
thank you so much, Linda. We're excited for everyone to read this piece.
Hello, my name is Joe Alvarado, and my paper title, Cartography of Sound, Body Mapping and Border Crossings in K. Ulande Barrett's Northern Organs and Aldrin Valdez's ESL, or You Weren't Here, is a chapter excerpt from my English honors thesis completed at UC Berkeley. This paper embarks on the odyssey of the queer diasporic Filipinx, a journey that has hitherto been neglected in English literary studies. Set against the backdrop of multiple imperialisms and ongoing migration, this project attends to a complex array of issues discussed in contemporary queer Filipinx American poetry, examining bodies in transit, bodies in translation, and bodies in transformation. In close reading Barrett and Valdez, my aim is to explore how queer Filipinx American embodiment can be uprooted and mapped within a poetic landscape that dissolves boundaries between languages, voices, genders, temporalities, and worlds. These collections elucidate not only alternative ways of mourning and healing, but also the breadth of queer diasporic imagination that transcends neat categorization or stringent conclusions. My work proposes that queer Filipinx American poetry can help us negotiate our vexed legacies in order to arrive at new, expansive possibilities of being, becoming, and belonging. Thank you.
Jasper is here with us today, and edited by Durga Isaac. So firstly, Durga Isaac would like to say any words, and then we'll move on to this.
Yeah, I'm Isaac. I'm a sophomore at CC studying political science and statistics. I don't want to say too much because the actual author is sitting right here. So cja.library.columbia.edu, but I will say that this was an absolute joy to read and edit.
And Durga, want to say anything on Zoom? Welcome to.
Yeah, I mean, it was a really interesting piece to edit with Isaac, and I really enjoyed the kind of connections it made between the student movement and resistance in Burma, and I feel like everyone should definitely read this article.
We'll take a recorded presentation.
Hi, my name is Jasper Luddington. I'm a junior at Columbia University studying history, and for the journal, I contributed the article "Incompatible Education: The Student Movement in Burma During the Interwar Period." I mean, as the title suggests, it really focuses on how British colonial education shaped Burmese education and culture in such a way that it fueled the Burmese nationalist movement later on during the interwar period. In all honesty, this is my first time taking a class on Southeast Asian history. Typically, I've looked at other periods in the 20th century and how education and religion shape and contribute to state building projects and revolutions. So, it's a bit different for me, but I nonetheless, I hope it is informative and I hope you guys enjoy.
Yes, so our next piece, Mao's Red Book, The City of Liberation, Pablo's America of the Repression. I believe we have Subin, Subin and Isabel are editors. You want to introduce yourselves first, and then we'll put it go. Introduce myself first. I'm Subin, and I'm editors who is college studying the session in Sanglar on the effects of Mao's Red Book in the trajectory of the city that should. Hi, I'm Isabel. I'm a freshman at CC, the major computer science and spatial studies, and I'm just having this part of this.
Hi everyone. Firstly, I would just like to say I'm really, really grateful for my piece being included in Columbia Journal Asia. I'd like to talk to everyone a bit about what inspired my piece. So my piece was actually inspired by a conversation I had 3 years ago with a friend. So I'd recently watched a documentary on Mao and his Red Book, etc. And I was telling a friend about it, and she had mentioned the fact that she didn't know much about Mao's Red Book except for what she had read about during her research. So at the time she was researching Attica prison rebellion for her dissertation. So it was just a massive prison rebellion that took place in the US in 1971. She said that she didn't know much except for what she had read about it during that prison rebellion. And what she knew was that prisoners during this rebellion were reading Mao's Red Book. And I just found that fascinating. I was just kind of like, what on earth is Mao's Red Book doing within that context? So I began researching and looking into it. Then, of course, at that time, many prisoners were also political activists and so on. And I started realizing, wow, there's this bigger thing of political activists in general using Mao's Red Book. So that was kind of the springboard. And then I was like, oh, this contradicts the way Mao's Red Book is viewed within the China context, based on my knowledge of knowing that period is the Cultural Revolution and the book being a symbol of oppression. So that's kind of the inspiration behind the piece.
Yeah, of course. So I introduced myself. So I'll just talk about my reflections for this piece. So it was personally really enriching to engage with this research because so this research was on the use of volunteering as a method for social integration by immigrants. And as an immigrant myself, who is also very passionate about community service, it was just really great to reflect on my own experience while also engaging with the research.
And Eunice, as a writer in the editing process, was also so fantastic to work with. She was very open to incorporating peer review feedback, and especially regarding narrowing her focus specifically to the Korean immigrant experience, which was something that we worked on in the research process. And yeah, it was just a great article to work on, and I believe she has a video, so we can hear more about her.
Hi, my name is Eunice and I'm a junior at Cornell University. Last semester, I took a really insightful anthropology seminar called Asians in the Americas, and our readings combined theories on ethnicity and belonging with practical fieldwork on different groups of the Asian diaspora. We also had meaningful discussions of our own stories and experiences, and as an international student from Hong Kong, it was fascinating to me both personally and academically to see how similar and different the experiences between the Asian diaspora versus those of the homeland could be, especially with regard to maintenance and expression of culture, which is a really important topic for many people. My paper takes a cross-disciplinary approach to rethink the role that ethnicity plays in the social integration of immigrants, how immigrants balance expressing their own identity while experiencing social integration through volunteering. So it does this by analyzing sociological findings from 3 studies on volunteering by Korean immigrants in the US through anthropological frameworks of ethnicity by thinkers such as Frederick Barth, who built on Edmund Leach's work. Such work highlights ethnicity as a process of social organization, which is dependent on human agents and situations rather than just being given, and this can shed light on patterns and motivations of volunteering among immigrants in the US.
Okay, hello. Sorry, jump scare. Hi everybody, I'm Arman. I'm a sophomore in CC, and I've been lucky enough to work on creative pieces for CJA this semester. I'll speak a little bit more about the role of creative pieces in CJA before moving on to the specifics. So I think creative pieces are super integral to what we do at CJA because they transform it from a journal of Asian studies to a journal of Asia, because they add a subjective focus to concepts of Asian identity, integration, global politics that we otherwise would see in like a more academically focused journal. Yeah, and I'm lucky to have collaborated and worked with really fabulous team members as part of the creative team, and also Ashvan Patwa, who are here today, as part of the article team and outreach team. So thank you everybody who worked on this publication.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm muting. I'm muting there. Yes.
Okay. Wait, do I unmute here?
This is a struggle. Okay. I think let's speak loud. We'll just speak loud. Like this, this speaks,
Okay, I'll project. I'm not sure if we have Andrew on Zoom or not. I suspect
Andrew is out sick with COVID,
yes,
sadly. Yeah.
But I'll just share a little bit about this piece and then I believe have an author's note. So working on these 2 poems, Dragonfly and Hometown, written by Elia, was a pretty fabulous experience because it required really minimal editing from us. So all our feedback was tangential, and the spirit of the piece really shines in the original product and the final product as well. So and it also sparked some conversation about what is an Asian piece of writing, what is Asian identity, like what is in the bounds of CJA. So this is definitely like a really thoughtful piece to work on, and I hope everybody will hear it.
Hello, readers. My name is Elia Zhang, and I am currently a history and philosophy double major senior student at Columbia University. I am very honored to be able to present my 2 poems for this issue of Columbia Journal Asia. For the first poem called Dragonfly, it is to use this metaphor, dragon, which is something that Americans would associate with the Chinese, and this additional kind of a word called dragonfly, which is type of insect that I used to play with a lot in my grandparents' place back in the days when I was a kid. And it is about how to reconcile the cultural heritages that one has and how to place one's family history within the broader history of modern China. And I use some references to historical events. So I'm just gonna read the last few lines. The harder you try to cut the string, the tighter it binds, and you hope to cut it loose and cling to it at the same time. Into the shape of a dragonfly, the wound has metamorphosed. The arrow of its spine, shadowed on the sand, refuses to be categorized. Thank you.
Okay, so these three poems are by Grace Song. I believe you have a note from her, so I'll let her explain the purpose and hypothesis.
Hi, my name is Grace Q. Song, and I'll be reading one of my poems in this video. Order. It was like a gift. The sun was 70 degrees, and I wore my best jeans, a black graphic tee. You needed a haircut. Under a sycamore tree, we dozed the small, cruel dream of our life away. The wind blowing over our faces like a marble river. Ruin above all things was patient. I was only 18. The clementines I gave you, those small, bright bells, would be gone by morning. When you drew near, touching the inside of my wrist, the waves washed between us in beauty and terror. Thank you. Hi.
I believe similarly we have a note from the writer about this piece, so I will just let her take it.
Hi everyone, I'm Aya Badala and I wrote the short story Pearls and Black Gold. I started the story when I was taking a history class on the Indian Ocean world, and we were assigned to read a primary source memoir written by a Kuwaiti who was in the pearl diving business before oil was discovered in the region. So I've always loved creative writing, and so when we were assigned a creative final project instead of a traditional history paper, I thought I would use my passion for creative writing, as well as my interest in the history of pearl diving and the Arabian Gulf, to write this story. So the story is narrated by an old Kuwaiti man living in 21st century Kuwait City. And he basically reflects on his life from when he was a pearl diver in the early 20th century. And I chose to use an older man as the character, as the main character in the narrator, so that I can also tell the story of Kuwait's change over the 20th century. So the narrator is able to show us how his personal experiences were affected by Kuwait's economy moving away from pearl diving and towards oil, and how little Kuwait town eventually became Kuwait City with giant skyscrapers, and how the little dhows in the harbor turned into giant ships with giant shipping containers. So focusing on the narrator's personal story allowed me to explore how broader themes in history, such as faith, family, life, culture, and economy, affected that society and his people's personal experiences over the century. Now, just a little bit of a disclaimer, I'm not from Kuwait, so this is not an own voices story. This was based on my research of primary and secondary sources, but it does go to show that using creativity and historical scholarship can often enrich our understandings of history, both as scholars and as fiction readers. Thank you.
Right. The next piece that we're showing is 1620, which is by Mo Chang. It's a painting, as you can see here, and I think you also have a note explaining the piece, and also be learning something the piece when you look at the contribution.
And we're lucky to be publishing Emo for a second time because we included their artwork in the spring. Right.
Hey everybody, my name is Emo Chong. I am a Columbia University student majoring in political science and economics. I'm really honored to be able to present my painting twice in a row in this journal. This painting is the third in a larger series of art called Progress, capital P, that depicts moments in my personal life and aims to give context to the well-acclaimed liberalization of the Chinese economy. I tried to show in this painting a glimpse of the construction workers I saw in their van in 2021 when I was in Beijing. Most of the workers in Beijing are migrant workers without a Beijing hukou, which is a system of citizenship inside China. Without the Beijing hukou, you are unable to enroll your kids in public education or have the government insurance cover your hospital visits. So these migrant workers rely solely on employers' insurance and leave their children back home. While their social benefits are segregated, the wealth they have created with their labor travels across province borders and stays in Beijing for us to enjoy, like roads, skyscrapers, public transportation, etc. There are many other labor abuses like delayed wages, unpaid work-related injury bills, and with the lockdowns, travel restrictions, and manufacturer shortages in Beijing, they spent the last 3 years unable to leave or work, with many emptying their savings to pay rent and the rising cost of living. So when I saw a group of them pass by in their van at 4 p.m. One day, I thought I would depict them the way I saw them, without a glorifying Soviet realism or dehumanizing neoliberal lens, just the way I saw them in that moment, older, bored men, estranged from their labor, their products, and the sense of self.
All right, that's all for
Yes. All right, thank you. Shout out to Arman again, who's done an amazing job with all of these and directing them, and the entire team of creative editors.
And just the last word, the reason I was late is because I think I include, there are some lovely copies of the cover art in that Blu-ray envelope, so please feel free to take a copy with you. And for one of your friends and one for anyone else.
Yeah, we'll start and we'll hand them out. And before we leave, please make sure that you get one. And we want to make sure we also save them for our faculty panelists. But with this, I think Karna will take it away.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And our wonderful panelists.
The panelists that want
Yes,
to come
to
Hey, how are you? Long time no see.
Yeah.
Why not? And was the head of the family. Yes, why not? We've met. No, not with you. Isabel. Isabel is nice to meet you. And then I just came from another conference. Okay. Yeah, thank you guys so much for coming. Okay, so we're gonna start the faculty panel. I'll do quick introductions. But we decided that as you can kind of see from the cover art, the general theme for this issue was revolutionaries and resistance across borders. As you listen to our wonderful authors, a lot of our pieces kind of echo this theme about transnational migration, resistance in diaspora, resistance in times before we had borders in the kind of modern sense we understand today. So we kind of wanted to unite this issue under this theme of revolutionaries, resistance, and borderlands. So we have our wonderful panelists here, all who are also supporting our journal on the board. So I'll start with introductions. So Professor Alonso is a historian of sound media and modern South Asia, the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies.
Yeah,
Maybe otherwise they're seeing me.
Here we go. How is? Oh, that's good. This is good. We can see everyone. Hopefully we can hear everyone. You wanna, yeah. Yeah, okay, great. So okay, let us know if you need us to do anything else, audio or yes, visual wise. But yeah, okay. Professor Alonso's book, Radio for the Millions, Hindi Urdu Broadcasting Across Borders, is a transnational history of radio broadcasting in Hindi and Urdu from the late colonial period through the early post-independence era, and is out now. It has also a beautiful cover. She also researched an Indian anti-colonial leader, M.N. Roy's sojourn in revolutionary Mexico, which forms parts of a larger interest in revolutionaries whose political work transgressed their society's intellectual and physical borders. You know, very, very on theme. And then we have Professor Tadiar. Am I pronouncing that? Professor Tadiar is a professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Barnard College. She is the author of Things Fall Away, Philippine Historical Experience and the Making of Globalization and Fantasy Production, Sexual Economies and Other Philippine Consequences for the New World Order, which was awarded the Philippine National Book Award in Cultural Criticism for 2005. And we are so happy to have you here and talk about especially our article on the poetry for queer Philippine Americans and examining diasporas, examining bodies in transit, and examining them in translation. Thank you so much.
And the amazing new Remainder Live.
Oh yeah. Oh yes. Very exciting. Yes, thank you so much.
Amazing book.
Oh gosh. We would love to hear you talk a little bit more about it as we move on to our first questions. And then Professor Ahmed, thank you. He's a historian of South Asia and Western Indian Ocean world at the history department. Professor Ahmed's areas of specialization include intellectual history in South and Southeast Asia, critical philosophy of history, colonial and anti-colonial thought, and he's interested in how modern and pre-modern historical narratives create understanding of places, communities, and intellectual genealogies for their readers. And he also co-taught a class this semester on borderlands on the spatial history of empire. And we would love to hear you talk a bit more about that as well. So we can move to our first question, which is very broad. And it's like, how do you understand borderlands in your work? As we kind of discussed in the intros, each of you have written about transnational movement, borderlands, and ambiguous spaces before, and if you could generally just speak about what the term means to you. Whoever wants to start. Or we can go clockwise.
It's such a good question that's like, I mean, I could start with, I did not begin my research on radio broadcasting ever thinking that I would be working on border or borderlands. It's not sort of the way I imagined it, it's the way that it came to it. And the reason why is I began thinking when I wanted to work on radio broadcasting, it just seemed obvious to me that you had to do a study that across borders. Like, how else would you study it? I had to do it because of how I grew up. I grew up in the US-Mexico border, and it just made sense that you look at both of them. And I did not, as I sort of went into the research, then it became obvious to me that this was that the making and the unmaking of borders was the main theme. But it was not something that I began with. And it was also, none of the people that I spoke to, none of the broadcasters, none of the listeners would ever identify themselves as revolutionaries, nor would they ever think of themselves as sort of creating or new borders or creating new ways of spaces. This was done in a way, it was done at a time period in a way of simply living and surviving. And I find that to be really important because in so much of our scholarship, it is so easy to give the state all the power. And that's because our archives show that, right? So it's so easy for that to happen. And in an ordinary lives, there's many ways in which, of course, the state has all the power and capitalist systems have all the power, but there's also many ways in which it isn't. And I think suspending our natural, the sort of natural desire just to give that more power is really, really important. And that's how that came about. That's how the idea of this really being a story of borders. To be honest, the title of the book, Across Borders, it was not even my idea. It was the editor's idea. So it used to be Politics of Sound. And then the editor was like, politics is everywhere, do something with it. And then he said across borders. And I was like, oh, wait, yes, of course, that makes complete sense. But it's not the way I began when I, right? And it's also not the way that the people that I spoke to necessarily phrased it. It was the way in which they lived it. That's what.
I don't actually talk about borderlands specifically in my work, but you're mentioning the the observation that these are places of living and survival. I think that borderlands conceptually maybe makes its appearance in my own work when I see the way that territorial, conceptual, epistemological borders are crossed all the time in the way that people survive, in the sense that the world isn't in the neat categories, isn't lived in the neat categories with which we think about it, or the way that they're imposed, whether they're identities or nation states. That in fact there's a lot of selective regulation and maintenance of borders that are conditions of war, but conditions of war that are created by states, right? So you have whether it's a US-Mexico border or borders between nation states that allow states to regulate whether it's currency rates, economic evaluations, or trade agreements, etc. Those are all very real. Or to negotiate migration and overseas work. All of those things are very real. But the people who are living in them, they also have their own interfaces. They also are able to cross in many ways, not only in terms of what they do, the forms of living that they create, but also who they are, what kinds of persons they are. It doesn't quite match necessarily the ways that they're being regulated. So I think that's where I would say borderlands isn't necessarily a place, but as a liminal threshold for living, which sometimes is occluded by our own understanding because we don't see with the kinds of lenses that allow us to see what's happening there. Because we're always on one side or the other, or we accept the way that the world is organized for us. And so for me, borderlands is both material in all of these territorial and social ways that people are kept from each other, but it's also epistemological. How do you see beyond what you were taught to see because of the habits of cordoning off different peoples and different forms of life from each other?
Thank you to the Columbia Journal of Asia for giving us this opportunity to speak. The cover looks amazing, and the issue also looks just very blockbuster. So kudos to all involved and all the volunteer labor. I guess in my case, in my scholarship, I am generally a scholar of long before transnationalism or nationalism becomes a thing. I worked as a graduate student on the 7th and 8th centuries, which do exist. Doesn't even matter where, but they do exist. But also I came to this country as an undergraduate. I was undocumented for a long time. So I saw the impact of bordered spaces and access to knowledge. I couldn't apply for many scholarships or any way in which financial aid could be given. And that actually organized the way I was thinking about the very deep past that I was researching, because not only is the sense that nationalism creates these borders around which modern capital and the nation state organize our contemporary lives, but also that these borders extend back into time. And that's something that, I learned. I learned that you could say that someone is French in the 11th century in the same way that someone might be French in the 20th or the 21st century. In fact, one of the major forms in which the French Arab population is discriminated against is precisely that the idea of being French is kind of picked up from the 18th century. So the borderlands that I have researched and I work on and I think about are shaped by our present, even though I don't work on the present per se. And since the question was how we came to this and how we imagine it, I think very much like Professor Tadiar was saying, this is about kind of embodiment and living and how individuals try to make their way across different types of political systems. I work on the Indian Ocean, so it's a very, let's use the word hybrid. Different modalities of existence are there, various forms of freedom are there, various forms of kind of linguistic and experiential kind of expressions are there. And actually, one of the texts or one of the thinkers that had the most profound kind of impression on me was Gloria Anzaldúa, who, as a queer Chicano feminist, theorizes precisely this position of past and present, of being in the borderland space between US and Mexico, between indigeneity and settler colonialism. And so those are the types of things that help me think about 12th to 13th century Indian Ocean world that I am generally working.
Thank you for that really in-depth understanding of how, not necessarily borderlands as a concept, but the idea of, borders and separations are kind of inherent in conceptually the history of humanity. And I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how the idea of borders have changed in your work, like how the concept of borders, either physically or conceptually, have changed. I know Professor Emma just talked a little bit about the idea of borders between the France and Arab world changing. And in Professor Alonso's class, I remember we talked a bit about, how do we draw the borders when defining South Asia, depending on historical time period. But the idea of, how do borders change both physically and conceptually, kind of all the time. And it's not like a teleological change, but they often like switch back and forth also, depending on, political and social agendas.
I think it also depends on what's at stake, right? So this is a little tangential, but for me, it has also been epistemological in sort of the ways that I define it, because it's also, we can think about what it means, what those borders mean for the time periods and the people that we study, but it's also about the academy that we speak to. So for me, that was also in terms of fields. And there is an enmity, I would call it, between media studies and historians, sort of they don't like each other. And in the beginning, it was hard for me to convince historians that media mattered until Trump was elected, and then they kind of realized that media matters. And then, then you couldn't say so. Until it became clear that social media was right here and Trump was elected, and they couldn't say it doesn't matter. But the other way around as well, right? That media history is history, but also that the historical methods and archives and the ways in which historians do so, and the emphasis on longer periods of time that historians take are valuable for media studies. So in my work, I found that the first border, the Indo-Pakistan border, sort of became the focus of it, and I really had to cross it with my work, because that's what my interlocutors were doing. It became up. But the second one developed really slowly, and developed in some of the pushback that I received. And I really developed that in classrooms with students. It was really helpful. And I found, because of good students, were much more open to the basic idea that media matters for history, that I was able to really begin to cross that border and to talk about how I might do that in my research. Right.
I guess I always follow on you because I can relate to what you say.
Well, I got that from you, this is a lot of explain.
No, which is that, yeah, there is the borders of the disciplines. You know, I'm an interdisciplinary scholar, even though I was to some extent disciplinary trained in comparative literature, but I didn't feel that the comparative literature had enough literacies for me to explain what I needed to explain. So I had to teach myself political economy, and I had to read all sorts of anthropology, sociology, precisely also because one of the ways that I feel like besides the methods, which I think is very important, to not be altogether determined by the methods that are dictated for particular objects, and to cross the disciplinary borders so that you can say something about these objects that you're very interested in, but you couldn't see it because you were curtailed by the method, or vice versa, which is that you see that your object isn't actually this object, but something that extends beyond that, you can find in other places. And maybe that's the comparative dimension, but you wouldn't be able to see that if you hadn't done it. And I'll just give some examples. I mean, in the latest work, I felt like I'm a scholar of Philippine studies. So yes, borders have have changed materially, historically, in the sense that we're in a much more globalized world now than when I started my scholarship. At the time, labor export was very minimal, but now we have a huge diaspora. The Philippine diaspora is very important in the global economy, and you can find them everywhere. So there's a sense in which the borders have been crossed, but they're highly regulated in different ways. A tourist coming from the Philippines is regulated very differently from a worker who can then go to Europe and who gets to be an immigrant, who gets to settle permanently versus who has to keep going back or who has limited time. These are real borders that have these are different changes in the borders that have happened in my lifetime in between the three books. But just in terms of interdisciplinary methods, I found that in this most recent book, I found that I really couldn't just tell the story of the Philippines without, in the same way that Professor Ahmed says that Florian Sodu was very important to thinking about, the Indian Ocean in the 13th century. For me, Black studies was really important for thinking about disposability. Indigenous work was really important for me, thinking about land. I needed to draw from some of this critical work in order to explain what I thought was pertained to the Philippines and Philippine workers, etc. And then it's that way that I could see also the connections across carceral systems, across wars, across violence, while not saying that they were all the same. The interdisciplinary focus and the methods allowed me to make connections that I feel help us see each other.
That was really touching, powerful.
It's hard to follow that. It's I think so I'll say two things. First is, the border is by force an ontology, so it shifts. So this ontology is maintained by violence, right? So the idea that on this side you're a citizen and on that side you are quote unquote illegal, the idea that your capacity to move across an imagined line determines your rights, your morality, oftentimes your race in a particular way. And I think in my work, or in thinking generally about it, the role of colonialism in shaping, creating these ontologies, giving a map to something called Asia, becomes really key to my understanding. But actually, I want to pick up this thread on disciplines rather expand that a little bit, because history, the discipline that we're in the history department. This is the history seminar room. On my paycheck says historian on top of it. We gatekeep. We are the bad disciplinary forces that my dear colleagues are referring to, and well deserved. No, well deserved. History is as I often say to my students, history is the prime vehicle for colonization. The conquest of the past predates the conquest in present. History is the discipline that is used to take away the histories, the past, the possibilities, and the futures of those it colonized, those that Europe colonized. The fact that indigenous practices of history writing and historical thinking were the very first victims of the European colonization. Same in South Asia, same in Africa, and same in. So history has a very particular role to play in bordering and then gatekeeping. So we don't want to know too much about, media studies. We don't want to know too much about anthropology. We don't want to know too much about, literature and so on and so forth. And as a graduate student, I was indoctrinated through those processes. I was told that in order to be a serious historian or to be taken seriously as a historian, certain types of writing practices, certain types of citational practices. Professor Tadiar mentioned, how important Black feminist thought and Black thought was, and indigenous thought was for her work. We can pick up any book 15 years ago in any major field of history, and I would challenge you to find a citation of any Black scholar in it. It's not like there weren't Black historians, they weren't cited in. So this is a formal way in which bordering happens within disciplinary spaces and within which disciplines border themselves against. Actually, one of the nice things about the journal, as all of you know, is the presence of quote unquote research and quote unquote creative works. One of the most remarkable things about all of the anti-colonial revolutionaries, no matter where in the world they may be, you will notice is that they did all of the things. They wrote poetry, they wrote social science, they wrote history, they wrote memoirs, they wrote autobiography, they painted, precisely because there is no bordering of the spirit of revolution or of anti-colonial thought. And I think we kind of are trapped in gilded cages of our own. Again, we here, just the historian parts of it. My colleagues are fine.
We have our own traps. It is gatekeeping there too.
Well, so traditionally, like in the world of academia, we operate, as you said, in these kind of boxes within departments, within fields, within states or like periods of time. We're like bounded by these categories. So how do we go forward and try and situate like borderlands, frontiers, intersectional conversations, not at the margins, but at the center of the relationship between, power, narrative, empire, colony, and what perspectives might we be able to gain from this practice?
I think that question has to do with power, right? Who has access to power and who has access to speak for what and where. So I can tell you, growing up on the border, now there's a term for it, transfronteriza, but there's a lot of people that cross the border every day of their lives, and it's quite normal, especially in the US-Mexico border. Those who have access to a visa that want to work in the US at any time often for those visas. And of course, but there's a very real sense, and it's almost sort of physical, that the border is at once rigid and at once porous. And that's almost sort of innate. If you grew up there, you know that. That knowledge, that's just in everybody's, and you know that it can be very rigid for some, it can be porous for us, and you're aware. And that knowledge is sort of shared but I didn't really see it in academic practices, only on the margins. And the reason is not because that knowledge was not important, but it's because who was in power, like who had the access to research the thing to open, right? And I think if we want to question that, then we have to question who's in power and who we need to put in power and which narrative we want to value. And I think Professor Ahmed's point about which citation practices is at the core of that. There has been scholars talking about this for a long time. They just have not been put at the center. So it's when you put those narratives at the center that we're going to change that conversation.
Well, I think you know, some of these foci like the Indian Ocean and Trans-Pacific studies and transatlantic studies, and you know, these oceanic spaces are a way of centering, you know, the interactions and crossings rather than, you know, what takes place in the familiar stages, the stories that we know always. I think also, you know, what it changes is our, you know, sense of unified space and time. As a literature person, I can tell you that that's the first rule of much of Western literature: unified space and time. You write a story, you need unified space and time. But I think what centering these liminal spaces or these spaces that have crossings is that you find that there's multiple spaces and temporalities and peoples that are crossing through. And so what it does when you start centering that rather than centering the familiar stagings of stories is that you are actually forced to hear out what other languages, and I don't mean just linguistic languages, what other languages there are available to describe what is happening. So you're actually forced to both be creative and to be responsible, because you have to actually see and hear what the experiences of people are and the ways in which they describe things, not just something to explain, but themselves to be part of your explanatory framework, because it's from, you know, and I think that's what Ansel Lewis' work was doing. You know, it's like from the borders, how can you, you know, see the rest of the world? That becomes the frame rather than just trying to explain this weird little liminal space. You know, and I think that's what, and I also applaud you with the mix of creative things. It's because, you know, when you start mixing the genres, you can see different things, and that's how I see literature. It's not something to explain, but it's to give me insight into the experiences of people and how they frame things, and that adds to my conceptual vocabulary.
Yeah, I mean, I think echoing what has been said, I think how we center is also how we see ourselves. And I think exactly how Anzaldúa, Du Bois, Fanon, you know, figures who didn't write or think or resist by imagining themselves on the periphery or on the margins, who imagined the world unequal, arrayed against them in many ways, but with them at the center, with their positionality at the center. And I think that's from where a type of scholarship or a type of engagement with the world has to occur. Of course, the disciplinary courses, you know, in the sciences and in our academy, which is hierarchical, which divides by interest or language or region, et cetera, are there, but so are generations upon generations upon generations of scholars and activists and thinkers who have been writing from that perspective, that this, you know, the borderlands is the center, that's from where we see the world. And then it goes to, again, maybe reiterating that the point of citation, the point of learning has to be open, that we have to be open to learning from as diverse source based as we can.
Shifting slightly to the theme of revolutions and revolutionaries, especially in the post-war era, we have seen how revolutions and revolutionaries have fought to assert their nationhood and have focused on national boundaries. So I wanted to ask about like how have nations, revolutionaries, and citizens reached across borders for inspiration, solidarity, and support? And how are borders created and affirmed today, not just by those within them, but also those beyond them?
Let's think about it a little more. Prefer not to go first.
Oh, okay. I wrote about the contemporary Philippine revolutionary movement in my second book. I have 3 chapters on the revolutionary movement there that has been happening since 1968. It's one of the longest ongoing revolutionary movements in the world with a very mixed history. You know, it was a communist revolution. It still is a communist revolution. So its beginnings were already international, already crossing borders, because there's a long history of communist aspiration and theory, from, of course, Marx to Mao, Marx, Lenin, Mao. And you see that the revolutions took inspiration from each other, whether it was the Vietnamese, the Nicaraguan, all of these, but they're already always in some kind of dialogue. They're always watching each other because, you don't wage a revolution by yourself. You look out to see what kind of solidarity you would have. But there are also internal borders within revolutionary movements, which between classes, for example, there were a lot of young students and young people from the cities who went to the countryside in the 60s because they wanted to stage this revolution, because they felt across class the sympathies and identifications, and that also had a lot of kinds of effects. But movements also have histories of creating borders of their own within, deciding, what's the place of women, who's more revolutionary than the other. And then sometimes there was a lot of crossing of borders between the military, the state military, and the guerrilla movement. I mean, there's a novel that I discussed where literally the guerrillas and the military are like changing people and arms. Like it's like a constant cycling through. And this has to do with kind of the shared language of militarism. So I have a feminist critique of that, but also that's a real part of revolutionary movements. So in the current moment, though, this is a constantly transforming movement in the kinds of sympathies that you get across borders. Now that we have such huge diasporas, there are also divisions within the diaspora about how you feel about your homeland, nation state, and it creates all kinds of borders among what would be a unified, would be a larger diaspora. But at the same time, people in the diaspora, they're not limited in their actions, in their political actions to the states, to the nation states where they live. They actually have a lot of effect and power because they maintain relations across these spaces. So in effect, as many of you know, we're still so connected by families, kinship, histories. It's not as if you cross a border and you don't maintain, and now in this technological world, those relations are up to the minute, and they can have many, many kinds of effects. So I feel like we're in a moment now where even any kinds of like revolutionary movements are really in the thick of global instantaneity and global relations, and that becomes this is a media studies project of what happens when all of your relations are mediated through these platforms, capitalist platforms. And as we see what's going on in China now, there's a lot of state control over the platforms and what's possible and not possible. And yet we see in Iran, there's also a lot of energy that can be mobilized to something as seemingly innocuous as Instagram.
I mean, I think part of this is there is a history of revolutionary solidarity, right? For Tagore, Asia is a revolutionary solidarity present, whether from India to Japan. Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, there's Pan-Africanism that Assad comes out of Egypt. There's the African-American solidarity that Malcolm X writes about. There's Patrice Lumumba's vision of the global South. So I think many forms, whether coming through anti-colonial struggle, anti-imperial struggle, towards socialism, communism, that imagine solidarities in the face of and after war. I think what has happened is both the kind of means of connecting as well as the means of, I guess, disconnecting or undermining have grown. I guess one example that has always stood out for me is the kind of moment of Tahrir Square in 2011. I was there. It was just like the world was one, and it was the first time I saw Twitter kind of, be used as a global mechanism, and it's been downhill since for Egypt, but also for that kind of idea of global solidarity. So I think both potentials are there. I think what I find missing is, generally speaking, is that the awareness of the type of history that Professor Tadiar was talking about, that people don't know that there is a long history of solidarity that exists across things that we imagine aren't in conversation. Folks in Harlem were in direct solidarity with folks in Morocco. Black Panthers literally existed in both spaces at the same time, existed in Bombay and Harlem at the same time. And that these were, pre the idea of the contemporary kind of simultaneity of mediation. So I think, yeah.
So I got extra time to think, and now I'm still not sure what to say. This is not right. I agree fully that our moment is one where both sides are there. But I do think that your question focusing on World War II is really important and interesting. And it's not really developed, so please don't quote me on it. But I like to think it through Emin Roy. So Emin Roy has a very interesting career and he's moved in Mexico. In Mexico, it is interesting. And he really is the dream of the dream of anti-colonial world solidarity. And it works really well during the interwar period. And then after the interwar period, he no longer makes sense. So when he returns to India and he has the desire to not have a nationalist vision of India, he doesn't really work with the Congress Party anymore. He tries to go with the Muslim League, but it doesn't really work. And he's still caught up in Communist International, but he gives it up. And I think that in the post-World War II, something happens where nationalism overtakes it, and it doesn't. There is still, I think Professor Ahmed is right. There is still solidarity across borders, but the kind of dream that was imagined in the interwar period is no longer fully possible, and that's why he becomes relevant. And I feel that there's more that can be said about that. That I would like to have more scholarship about it. And I really felt that because when I finished my work on Emin Roy in Mexico, I feel that a very similar thing happens in Mexico. So Mexican Revolution becomes a nationalist moment and it's about Mexican identity. And when it becomes about Mexican identity, it no longer has the it still is an international movement, but there isn't that room for a lot of those people who had much more intra-regional solidarity become a little bit irrelevant. And I think that's kind of what happens to him. But again, it's not very developed. So it's something I want to think about more, and not something I necessarily have been working on for this book. Something
That's really interesting. That in some way, like the space that revolution provides is actually perhaps broader and more accepting than the end of revolution and
there is a hyper-nationalist movement after World War II that we need to think about what it does. And I mean, it was interesting. We just got out of this the Babri Masjid conference. People even now are reluctant to criticize the Congress parties in the 50s and the 60s, when I think many of the roots of what happens and the ways in which Muslim communities are separated takes place under Congress, but it just doesn't feel good to do that. And I think it's because of these still enamorment that we have with that with the nationalist movement and our refusal to see some of the spaces there. Some of the not spaces, some of the solidarities that are erased at that time.
One thing I would want to add to this conversation is that you know, there are things that travel which are not just the ideas but the affective structures, and much of it travels through music. I mean, right now in Iran, they're singing some Latin American songs translated into Persian. And in India, I mean, in China, I just read today that, you know, this song from Les Miserables, for God's sake, is like being sung on the street. But one of the things that I've written about is the way that some of the revolutionary feelings migrated to the middle classes in the mid 80s and the 30s, that even though they didn't necessarily share ideologically, they were moved by many of the songs and structures of feelings that were passing through. And it was radio at the time, there's no internet. It was all radio. Everybody's listening to the radio. And it creates these structures of feelings that cross borders, and sometimes it doesn't rise to the level of like, you know, understanding, but it is a starting point for thinking of, you know, because you're already at this level where you can understand each other, but through this very amorphous, you know, affective structure, but not necessarily articulated. And it's worth thinking about. It's like that Professor Ahmed mentioned, like revolutions aren't contained to like, you know, manifestos. People write poetry and songs and art, and they have their own lives. They also, you know, they also move. And they move people, and that is a train of, you know, movement of political feeling that's worth looking into.
Thank you so much. I would like to open it up briefly for questions, and then we'll wrap up our second issue. If anyone has questions for the panel?
Yeah, we can start off with what we were just talking about regarding this idea of recreational solidarity. I just wanted to ask, so I don't know too much about this topic, but I really wanted to ask if that idea that all of revolution there may not be, for some reason there may not be room for this recreational solidarity, that has to do with it's like a desire for survival within communities that have just like experienced the instability that comes from revolution. So I feel like we discussed a lot about like the really inspiring things of revolution, but I was looking to maybe talk about like maybe the survival that may emerge from like the revolution that is very like unstable and is.
I mean, you know, there is something to be said, of course. I mean, if we take the example of 2011 Tahrir Square and the ousting of Mubarak, yeah, on one level you can see, okay, that the you know, what started happening in Syria, Tunis came first, of course, but Tunisia, Libya, all of these were seen as possibilities, but then they get retrenched almost immediately. Sisi is there. There's a war in Syria that, you know, is almost a decade long. So certainly that's a kind of possible way of thinking about it, that large numbers of populations in these places kind of retrench, though they are exposed to these kinds of trans-regional movements. But that's not quite what happens. What actually happens is that those who were advocating for pan-Arab solidarity, who were advocating for a type of democracy that hadn't been in the region and supported by the United States, were hunted down and killed. There are still political prisoners from 2011 in jail right now. there is not just that the nationalism provides a bulwark, but nationalism comes with, as I was saying, a type of violence to enact its idea of the nation state, whether it's militarized under, a dictatorship, or in types of kind of majoritarian nationalism that one sees in Turkey or in India, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not 100% sold that there's simply the revolution itself creates an after effect, which allows for retrenchment. I think the counter-revolutionary forces are actually quite important for us to keep in mind.
Yeah, I would echo that. Sometimes we make light of the continuing counter-revolutionary forces and the effects on people. I mean, certainly there's what they call war fatigue. People get, especially when they're out in actual underground movements, they want to return to urban life. They want to have their families and so forth. But then you can't underestimate, just recently, this young woman who was a poet in the Philippines, since she was in high school, during the pandemic, she was killed. I wrote one short introduction to her collected poetry, and then just 2 days ago or 3 days ago, her husband, who was also a poet and also an organizer, was killed by the military. And so they just continue to kill people. They just continue to assassinate people, and it is under the radar of the news because they continue to see people who are organizing and as terrorists, and that just settles it for everybody. Nobody really thinks about who were they, what were they doing, etc. And certainly that has effects. It has a chill factor. People are afraid, but people also continue to organize. But those are, when you say those conditions of uncertainty, those are ever present. During, before, after, during and after, those are there. It's just that we don't always see those things happen because they're occluded.
I think it was very well answered.
Any more questions? Yeah. I'm interested in the feminist critique that was kind of being mentioned earlier. And I'm just wondering if it's possible to kind of hear more about that, because I'm just, as one example, I'm remembering in Professor Ahmed's seminar in the spring on South Asian historiography, we were looking at Bangladesh's liberation war and the way that the kind of woman question has this central role in nationalism, but then also you have all these women poets who are active in the liberation struggle. And so I don't know, I'm just curious if it's possible to hear more about that in the context that you've worked in, how you.
Well, you've already mentioned, the important role of the figure of women in nationalist movement and in figuring out what the nation state is. And gender always plays a part in the creation of this imagined community, particularly in the modern era, and who women are supposed to stand for. And there is a patriarchal model of the state that we have inherited from colonialism. It doesn't necessarily reflect the way that communities live their lives, but then they have to organize themselves so that they can be legible to the state. And then, pretty soon you have titles of land, etc., going to men. But among the gendered critiques would be also that can continue under militarism is the way that one might think of, oneself in masculinist ways of the heroic revolutionary who, whether it's in relationship to the masses who are just these feminized people that you're going to save, this kind of savior thing, these imperial patriarchal feelings are everywhere from, saving the women in Afghanistan to being heroes and fighting for the masses who don't even have a say in what you do, or relegating the women to the domestic work while the guns and, just the tasks of the revolution. But there's also the glorification of war, the glorification of violence. I'm not against violence because, violence has become the tool and the thing that people have to address because it's the means. But then sometimes there's an critical embrace of certain forms of violence without thinking, and this is the feminist question. It's what kind of life are you going to create in this moment that you are fighting this, or are you just replicating all the ways that we've already, that we're suffering from? And those are real questions for revolutionary movements. And I think many of them do think of these things, how they organize their food production and all of these stuff. But it's very uneven because there are these dominant gender logics that shape what we think of as political action. What is the right political action? What should be done? What is more important? Is culture just a means so that you can seize the state? Those are some of the questions that revolutionaries ask themselves or don't ask themselves, actually. They get focused on, seizing the state, but, what is the form of the state? What is its relationship to the people? Those are all actually gendered questions. They are not just questions of political organization. They have real consequences for the lives of all genders because of the meanings that they create for who and how you're supposed to live and who's the proper subject of a revolutionary movement, and how some people they can't be the revolutionary subject because of the contours of who is the right one. But there's a lot more to this. There's just one way to think about it.
Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
So, in class earlier, we were talking about the linearity of the written language, especially in literature when you literally read line by line, you only encounter one at a time. And it seems to be kind of similar in the case of history as a discipline, at least because you usually highlight the narrative of the women. There's not a lot of space to work, I guess, in between lines. So I think one I'm curious about, as Professor Alonso mentioned, that you kind of steered away from kind of limiting yourself to one, just the discipline of literature. And I was wondering, like, maybe with everybody, like, how do you avoid this linearity in the different?
It's impossible to avoid it. I think we always have to remember that none of us are above our society's problems, and none of us are above our society's, our discipline's issues, right? But what we can do is be conscious of it. And we can do is also be conscious of linearity as a Western construction to understand history. Right. I think, and in having that consciousness, we can speak against it and work for it and not take it for granted. But to fully avoid it, I think that is like fully avoiding hierarchy in a university context. It's really, truly impossible. But the awareness is where it begins. And I think that that's true for linearity, but it's also incredibly true for questions of gender. I often have students say, well, my project is not about gender. No, your project has to be about gender. I don't care, because every project has to, you cannot not talk about gender. Every project, you can say that this is about masculinity, but you have to talk about gender as well. And I think that's true for the question of linearity as well. Any historical project has to address that project. It has to address that question.
I would just agree with, avoidance is not the best method of doing anything. Because you're in a negative reaction mode. Instead, maybe you want to ask the question, if it's like, what kind of stories can you tell with that, that better fit, the kind of complexity of what you want to tell, and not feel that you need to fit it in with the genre that you've learned. And we're going to come up against many things, but it wouldn't be just about avoiding it and saying, check, I didn't do that. It would be like you would be creating something along the way, and and also learning from other people who have also. I think that's the thing that we should also remember, that many people have been tackling these questions, and they have given us really an abundance of examples that sometimes we just need to be able to see and reckon with, that, oh, this isn't actually like that this is giving me a new way of not only approaching it, but also expressing the stories we want to tell.
Yeah, I can only say yes, as underline what's already been said. I think, just as there is a disciplinary force that makes linearity as natural or given or unavoidable, etc. There are thinkers, people that are just as fundamentally anti-linear and can provide us with just as much information about how to kind of think through it and for it. And I think the creativity is exactly there. The political commitment has to come. You have to kind of think of how the story you want to tell is informed by the world in which you were placed in, as Professor Alonso said, and then the world that you want to imagine, and who are the people who have imagined that world before you, and how do you help people who are going to come after you see your imagination.
Thank you. If we have any more questions, we can take one maybe really quickly. Otherwise, yeah, thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.
All the editors. I feel like we're really an incredible
achievement, really.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
We're left with like really heavy questions about like what kinds of like stories and lives you want to
Those are
create.
fun questions.
Those are the get to.
Yeah.
like about the centering. So I'm putting together my syllabus for teaching the core in semester. Contemporary, and I'm telling you, I just added two. I added Valeria Luiselli's study on Tell Me How It Ends.
Yeah.
I think it's called in English, something like that.
Yeah.
And Saldua, as you mentioned, right? So because I think that the making of borders and the violence of borders is such a product of Western civilization, and it needs to be studied as such, right?
Yeah.
So, and you invited me to this panel and made me make that change in the semester.
Okay. Thank you so much.
And before everyone, let's
I get rep for the brilliant people here.
Yeah. We also just very quickly want to say that the journal is live on our website, so please do read it. Yes, and we also, as a final note, wanted to share, so submissions are open to our first issue of volume 2. We'll share more about this later. For faculty, if you can share it with your students, we'll send you the call for submissions. And as a final point, as we mentioned, we are all stepping down, and we are very, very excited to welcome a new editorial board to take over the journal. So our mom is one of our new editors-in-chief. Durga is on Zoom. I don't know if you can see. Thrilled for them. We have Fatma as our managing editor. Ashfa as our director of peer review. Very excited, and yes,
there are postcards.
Yes,
if you
yes,
guys
please gotten. We'll be here. We'll
Okay,
just, but yes, so we'll be around. We'll be helping. Hopefully, maybe helping more with event planning than with last minute publication chaos, but yeah, they'll be.
And that's the first mistake of all revolutionaries. They hold on to power. So this is amazing. The revolutionary group has passed on power. That's the first mistake.
They use they start using the language of the colonizer, like everybody. There's embracing that.
So kudos to this revolutionary.
Thank you.
It's very impressive reading.
I mean, really, better than any journal I'm on.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming. Bye. All right.